Welcome to the Kindle Chronicles, the Friday podcast about your Kindle, books, and all things Amazon. I'm Len Edgerly. Today is March 1st, 2019. Welcome to you from downtown Denver. We returned here from our stay in Cambridge, Massachusetts 3 days ago. I'm on a tight deadline tonight because I'd like to get the show done before our friends Tom and Tish Atkinson arrive from Casper, Wyoming for a visit for a few days. They had planned to come on Sunday, but we've got a pretty serious winter storm warning coming our way, so they've decided to come down early. You may remember that Tom was a big help to me when we were shipping 1,000 Kindles to service personnel serving overseas. That was in our eBooks for Troops program a few years back. This week I had planned to interview the author A.G. Riddle about his latest book, Winter World, which was published this week. But Jerry came down with a bad head cold, and he said his voice was really not ready to be recorded. So luckily I had audio from my visit to my old school in Massachusetts, Belmont Hill School. So that's what you're going to hear in this episode. I made a presentation to a creative writing class of juniors and covered a number of topics which I hope will be of interest to you, and in particular I think you may enjoy the questions that I was asked at the end of the session, so you'll be hearing that. And before we get to the interview, I'll point you to a deep dive news story about the creation story of Alexa and a tech tip about how to find everything that Alexa has recorded on your Echo network. The article that I want to talk to you about was published in Wired last month. I came across it this week, and the author is James Vlahos. It's titled Amazon Alexa and the Search for the One Perfect Answer. I'll have a link to it in the show notes. It highlights someone I had never heard of in the UK, William Tunstall-Pedoe, Tunstall-Pedoe, was early on working on what would become Alexa. He developed a company that was researching this back in the early 90s, back when the internet was basically getting going. And his company created something called Eevee, which made its debut in January 2012, a few months after Apple announced Siri. And he was creating a device at about the time that Amazon was working on Echo. So when the Echo came out in 2014, its question answering abilities would be significantly powered by Eevee, this article says. And that buyer was Amazon, and the device was the Echo. The intriguing part of this story as well is the idea of voice technology, Alexa, giving us one answer instead of what we had come to see as the normal way that we find things on the internet. You Google something and then you get a list of links, and you can go down through the first page of links. Most of us don't go much beyond the first page of the links that are returned, and hopefully find something that's of use to us. The alternative way of looking for information and expecting to find it is called the one-shot answer. And Tunstall-Pedoe says that this was really kind of taboo in the early days of the internet and when Google was developing the search engine, because I think it was hard to do, and it wasn't something that people were tuned into expecting or wanting. Now, when we ask a question, the whole effort of the AI and the machine language and the crunching of the data to come up with the best answer for a question has gotten very sophisticated. And it opened my eyes to things which I can ask my devices here, which are much more complicated than what's the weather or set a timer, things like that. And I'm going to try a couple of examples here that I got out of this article to compare how Alexa does with the Google Home, the Google Assistant. So the first one is computer.
Answer your question.
Computer, is a bat a bird?
No, bats are mammals.
Okay, that's her answer. Hey Google, is a bat a bird?
On the website kidzone.ws, they say, a long time ago, people used to think bats were birds without feathers. But now we know that there is no such thing as a featherless bird. We know that bats are mammals, just like people.
Two good answers. They're both accurate. When I pulled it up on the Echo Show, there's an image of a bat, and Google is providing a little richer answer to that question. I call that one a tie. Computer, is Madonna single?
Madonna is not currently married. She has been married twice, to Sean Penn from 1985 to 1989, and Guy Ritchie from 2000 to 2008. She is reportedly dating Carlos Leon.
Hey Google, is Madonna single?
According to Wikipedia, Madonna performing Burning Up, the second single from her debut studio album on the Rebel Heart Tour. American singer Madonna has released 83
Hey Google,
singles
stop.
and
So Alexa wins that one. Google, it saw the word or heard the word single and went straight to a recording, whereas Alexa was the one to figure out that we were asking if she was married. Last one. Computer, how did the Romans tell time at night?
Sorry, I don't know that.
Hey Google, how did the Romans tell time at night?
On the website theconversation.com, they say, the Romans also used water clocks which they calibrated from a sundial, and so they could measure time even when the sun was not shining, at night or on foggy days.
Google definitely wins that one. The article describes some of the design of these things. You have a sort of a tree of knowledge that is built to try to branch toward answers to complicated questions, and quite well done, and gives you a feeling for how much work is going on behind the scenes to have natural questions answered in ways that are useful and coming up with, as they say, a one-shot answer. In passing, one tidbit in the articles impressed me. It said in 2018 alone, according to a report by NPR and Edison Research, the prevalence of smart speakers in American households grew by 78%. So I take that as a 78% of the number of smart speakers in our homes just last year. And I suspect that there's going to be continued growth of that nature this year. This fellow that created the voice that became Alexa is not with Amazon anymore. He left in 2016. It doesn't say where he ended up, but Mr. Tunstall Beddoe plays a real role in something which is becoming ubiquitous in a lot of our homes. The Wired writer puts this in a larger context by saying that what we're seeing is a shift of the conventional web, the one that we grew up with, that you think of Google and the searches, with what he's calling the conversational web. So using voice assistants to get a one-shot answer gradually, without us really noticing it, when we get a few more years down the road, it's just going to be the way we get information, and it's radically different with a lot of implications for advertising, and everyone wants to be in position 0, which is what they call the top result from a search. They don't want to be in the top 10 or the top 5. They really have to be in position 0, or else they're just not even going to be in front of the people who are asking the questions. For the tech tip, I will have a link to an article that I came across in The Verge, which talks about how to find the recordings that Alexa devices are making, and if you want to delete them, there's a way to clear them out. I followed a link on this. There's two ways to do it. You can you'll find directions on how to navigate to the recordings that have been made on your Alexa app on your smartphone, and then there's a sort of an easier or handier way to look at it on a computer. If you Google Alexa privacy, you'll find a page that has all of your recordings laid out in a very convenient way. So I was trying this out, and I thought, well, I'll hear my own voice. It was a little bit unnerving because I have Alexa devices here in our home in Denver. Also, I have them back in Cambridge, and it turns out that when I was listening to the voice history for today and the other day, I heard some voices that from the devices that are listed at our Cambridge home that were, and Darlene and I weren't there. So, well, who's giving Alexa devices commands at our home in Cambridge? Well, it turns out it's the workmen, and Kevin and John, the great guys. We really enjoy having them around. But apparently when we're not there, they know that these are Alexa devices, and they ask to play the Beatles, and they ask for some interesting music. And if I play these recordings, I can hear the voices, and it'll say, oh yeah, well there's Kevin. And you see it by day. You can see on the log, like here's one that says play the Beatles. So I'll play this, and you'll hear our friend Kevin talking to our Alexa back in Cambridge when I didn't know that he was.
Play the Beatles.
That was play the Beatles. And then he was also interested in another group from the 60s.
Play Donovan.
Play Donovan. I also was able to hear, because I'm hooked up with my parents' Amazon account so that I can drop in with the Echo Show, I was seeing devices that were listed at their house, at the place that they're living, and I was hearing their housekeeper, Marie, giving some commands to Alexa to play Mozart and play different things. So, there's nothing really creepy about this. I know all these people, and it makes sense that I'm not the only one using Alexa. Darlene can use them also. But you get a feeling for how this audio is captured, and it's available to us. And you can wipe them out if you don't like the idea of the voices of people that you're in your house that are using it. You can just delete all recordings for today. They also say that if you wipe out the history, then Alexa isn't quite as good at understanding what you're trying to say. So when I saw all of these, I thought, well, I don't know, no real reason to wipe these out, and I would like her to have to be smart in knowing what I'm saying. Anyway, especially if you've got a lot of devices, and if you're hooked up with any other family members and you want to hear how people are using the devices, I can imagine this might be handy if you've got children and your children are asking for problematic things for Alexa to do when you're not there. You can go in and find all of that, and if maybe you have to have some conversations about the proper use of technology in your home, Amazon's going to provide some information that could be useful. So Alexa is recording us and making it pretty easy to find out what she's hearing. Let's head now to Belmont Hill School in Belmont, Massachusetts, the school I attended for 6 years, including my high school years. It was founded in 1923. It is still an all-boys school, and the boys all wear coats and ties. So when I made my way to Belmont Hill from Cambridge a week ago today, on Friday, I ended up in a classroom with about 20 of the boys who they're called fifth formers. They use the form system. I think that's from England. And so fifth form is the same as junior or 11th grade. This was a creative writing class taught by Dr. Jean Tift, who is a talented teacher, a woman teacher. They didn't have those in my day 50 years ago. And I met her at my 50th reunion last year, and we got talking about how maybe the students would be interested to hear from me during her creative writing class. So that's how I ended up at Belmont Hill on this trip. It was really kind of a time machine too, because I get there and I wore a coat and tie. I thought, I don't have to, but I've out of habit, so I was dressed appropriately. And I'm thinking, why 50 years ago or more, I was sitting in these seats. Now, we didn't have the kind of seminar tables the way that these kids had, that we were all sitting around, more like a college setting almost. We had the little chairs with the arms on them, and everything's changed. There's been so many new buildings. The school has been very successful, so everything is new. I had to kind of locate by vectors the fact that Dr. Tift's class was near a favorite English class I had, Dr. Henry Sawyer, who would bring his golden retriever Robbie to class, things that you could do in a private school that probably are against the rules in a public school. So anyway, there I was, and I did some preparation. I really hoped I would have lots of time for questions. I ended up talking a little bit more than I hoped. We got a little bit of a late start, but you're going to hear me talk about self-publishing, podcasting, and low residence MFA programs. These are areas that I thought they might be interested in. And I set a Blue Yeti microphone in the middle of the table so that they would be able to make comments and questions. You'll hear a reference to the panel. There's an excellent school newspaper which is still published at Belmont Hill, and in my day, I was the editor-in-chief on it. That was a real important part of my high school years, and then I ended up being on the news board at the Harvard Crimson, the daily newspaper at Harvard, and after college got jobs as a reporter in Rhode Island and then as a energy magazine editor in Wyoming. So the nights that I spent working late putting the panel together ended up being a key part of my career after that. So this is Dr. Gene Tift introducing me, and I've lightly edited this, but you'll get a feel for my presentation and especially the questions afterward.
We're so happy to have Mr. Edgley here today. He's a Belmont Hill alum, so he was once in your position here and has done so many different kinds of writing and other things in your life. You've had a long and fascinating path. And we were just talking about you were editor-in-chief of the panel when you were here.
Yep.
So he's just here. I'm going to let you, if you don't mind, talk a little bit about your path and talk to us about I've already learned a lot just from looking at your slides about self-publishing. So this is great. I really appreciate you being here.
Good. Thank you, Gene. This is a pleasure. I feel like I'm traveling in a time machine to think 50 years ago to being. I think there was an English class right about here that I loved when I was at Belmont Hill, Mr. Sawyer, and he used to bring a golden retriever to his class. They're all very cozy.
We still have some dogs around here.
Good. Well, now what I'm doing, you'll see a microphone there, and so we're recording. And I have a weekly podcast called the Kindle Chronicles, and it comes up every Friday. So on March 8th, my plan is that we'll have some excerpts from this class as part of my 45-minute show on March 8th. And so I'm going to just try to talk for about half the available time, and then I hope we'll have a conversation and just throw questions at me about things I mentioned or anything else, and I think it will be of interest to my listeners. The podcast is about the Kindle, authors. I do a lot of author interviews, and Amazon. Those are kind of my three main areas, and probably about 500 to 1,000 people listen to each show. It's kind of a niche audience in terms of podcasts go. They tend to be pretty tech savvy, very literate, and so I think they're going to be interested to hear from you guys about what you're doing in creative writing, what kinds of thoughts you have about the future as you enter into the world of letters or whatever else you're doing in the creative arts, if that's your path. If you're going to ask a question, you might kind of lean toward the microphone, speak kind of clearly. You don't have to yell. And I'm thinking that the first time that you're on air, just say your name, what form you're in, where you're from. Just give a little bit of an intro the first time, and then we'll just let it go. The other thing is we're not broadcasting now. It's not live. It's recorded, and I'll edit. So if there's any mistakes or things, if you make some kind of grammatical mistake or something, I'll edit it out for you. I don't want to keep anybody out of college here. So that's what we're doing with the podcast. And I'm going to talk about podcasting, self-publishing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the low residence MFA program that I did in poetry at Bennington. And then we'll go into questions. So, how many of you, do any of you have a podcast yourself that you're doing now? How many of you listen to podcasts? Okay, good. My pitch for podcasting is, if you're a writer and you're doing the kinds of things you're doing in Gene's class here, one of the most important things is to find your voice. That a writer who has a clear, unique voice that's consistent and has really found the sweet spot of their own identity and their own voice. I've always found that's who the strongest writers are. So if you do a podcast, you're by definition using your voice. You're speaking. It's an oral form. And if you do it regularly on a topic that you care about, you have a chance to kind of learn the rhythms of your own voice. You hear how you're saying things that sound natural, and then you hear, that part seemed to be like playing a role. I wasn't really myself in that part. I've been doing it every week for 10 years. So over that period of time, when I go back and listen to older shows, I can really hear where I was struggling to kind of claim my voice. So I think that podcasting is a unique opportunity for anybody that's doing something creative, because in any creative endeavor, you're trying to find what do you have to offer the world that nobody else has, and podcasting can be helpful. The other great thing about podcasting is because you're putting stuff out on the internet, you start with something you're passionate about, and it can be very specific, and you're going to find your tribe of people who are also interested in that subject. And that's rewarding because you don't feel so alone. You feel like, well, I'm not the only crazy person who's interested in, the Kindle authors and Amazon. There's, several hundred people, maybe thousands. And when you hear back from your tribe, you're hearing their perspectives on things that you really care about. So each week, when I put up a show, I generally get email back from people saying, hey, that was great, I didn't quite agree with this, you should really interview this person because, they're a natural for your show. So there's kind of a dialogue with like-minded people who you can find via your podcast on the internet. And I think that's a big plus. The third thing is, if you pick something and then you stick with it, like I have for every week for 10 years, you become an expert. I mean, when I started out, and I like the Kindle, I like writing, I want to talk about it. When I got a chance to interview some of the people at Amazon, for example, I was a little nervous, like, what's this retired guy who's got a podcast? Why are they going to want to talk to me? And now, 10 years in, when Amazon introduces a new Kindle or a new Fire, they include me in the media sessions where they say, this is our new device, it's on embargo till next week. So I get to talk to these Amazon executives, and I have no worries because a lot of times these are guys that have come in like in the last 3 years, and I've been covering the Kindle for 10 years. And in some ways I know more about it than they do. And it's not because I'm so smart, it's just I've been paying attention to this subject regularly for so long that an expertise just kind of naturally develops. And that's really fun. If you got questions about things, the tools, the way that I do the podcast, I'm glad to talk about it. I'll just mention 3. When I record this, and I'll work on it in Logic Pro, which is the editing program I use, I create an MP3 file. I've got to get it up on the internet. So it's got to be somewhere on the internet so that when, if somebody hits the podcast app on their iPhone, they search for the Kindle Chronicles, and then they tap on the episode, it comes down from the internet to the device. And you have to pay somebody to store those files for you. I use Libsyn, and I think that's the one that has the biggest market share. I think I pay $15 or $20 a month for them to store all of my episodes. And if for some reason an episode gets crazy numbers of listeners, if there's 100,000 people that download it, I still pay only $20 a month. They don't charge me each time someone downloads it. They just charge me for the space on their shelf where I keep that episode. Blue Yeti microphone. I would expect at least half of the people doing podcasts are using this microphone. It costs $103 on Amazon. It's very high quality. You could pay more than that for a microphone. You could also pay less and get maybe 80% of the quality, but that one is really works well.
I wonder if we have one on campus that people could borrow. We do.
Probably do
Mr.
somewhere.
Seymour probably have
The
one.
music
Yes. Music
Yeah.
department.
and the snowballs
Yeah,
as well.
Yeah, the snowballs too. Now, when I record, I usually add a pop filter to that because there's these plosives. If I was just talking into that, you'd hear the pop sounds, and so it's better to have a round mesh thing in front of it. Okay.
Can I ask a question? Is,
Yeah.
do you have a recommendation about, so for you're writing short stories and maybe writing poetry soon and some other kinds of things, does that make more sense to do as a podcast where you hear the author reading a short story, or do you like the idea of self-publishing where it's a written thing for people to go to, or both?
I think both. I don't know too many podcasts. I'm sure they're out there. There's hundreds of thousands of podcasts. But I could imagine a podcast like, say, the work you're doing in the class here. Maybe it's a short story, maybe it's a poem. And if you could kind of identify your interest in your approach, you could be saying, I'm a student at Belmont Hill, and this is going to be a show about my work on this collection of short stories. And because a lot of people are very interested in the creative process. So particularly, guys your age, if you set a little context and say, well, why did I decide to write a short story about this topic? Well, I'll tell you, this is my experience, my background, my family, whatever. And then read the story. So you've given it some context, and then you've put it out there. I think that would be an example of a powerful podcast. If you were just putting up your stories or poems without that kind of context or introduction, I think it could be a little dry, a little hard to grab people. And then in the self-publishing, that's the next thing I'll talk about that give you a chance to compare those two options. When Amazon introduced the Kindle in November of 2007, the same day that the first Kindle was available, they launched something called Kindle Direct Publishing, KDP. And what that meant was that right from the start, if you had a novel or a collection of short stories and it was in a Word format on your computer, you could, without paying Amazon anything, upload it and have it be available for sale at Amazon.com along with the other millions of books that are there. And since then, in the last 10 years, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of people have done that. They've submitted things in ebook format, and they're available for purchase on Amazon. And what's happened is that some people have had great success doing that. They found readers. They're quitting their day jobs. They're becoming writers by being able to self-publish on this platform. And then Amazon, there's a lot of conflict between Amazon and the traditional publishers. So Amazon created its own publishing company called Amazon Publishing. And they kind of changed the rules. They're paying writers higher royalties. They are pricing ebooks more like $3 a book as opposed to $14 Random House and the others are charging. So it's kind of a rogue publishing entity that Amazon created. If you combine the Amazon publishing books with the self-published books, that accounts for 42% of U.S. adult fiction that was published last year. So it's become this huge, it's gone from basically zero. I mean, 10 years ago, self-publishing was vanity press. If you were a loser and you couldn't get your book published, you'd pay somebody to publish your book, and it was just kind of embarrassing. Those days are over. I mean, when people think self-publishing, they might think of Andy Weir, the guy that wrote The Martian, who self-published his book first, and then it went on to become published traditionally, a movie, the whole thing. There are any number of self-published authors who started that way to the point where this is now just a real option if you're, hoping to publish a book someday. So I would just say, if in your future you see yourself writing a book, yes, the traditional sector still exists. It's wonderful. There's fabulous people work at those big publishing companies. If you can find an agent, and the agent can sell your book and all of that. But there's this whole other path now that didn't exist 10 years ago, and it's worth being aware of as you think about being an author. Kindle Direct Publishing, now I'm thinking, all right, you guys are creative, you're doing things, you maybe want to have some audience and get some reaction. Kindle Direct Publishing, if you've got a book of short stories, you could just, tonight, go publish a book on Amazon. They take 24 hours to make sure it's not goat porn or something, and then if it passes their censors, it'll be up there tomorrow morning, and your cousin in San Francisco can buy it. So that's one path that's available. Has anyone heard of Wattpad? Wattpad?
No.
Okay, Wattpad.com is it's a publishing platform, and you can sort of write your book in real time and get feedback from people as you're putting up chapters.
Wow.
And I did this about 5 years ago in a book I was writing about the Apple Watch when it came out. And it was pretty cool because I'd sit there and I'd write a chapter, I'd hit publish, and then a few people would read it. I'd get a few responses back saying, hey, that was interesting, but what about this? And there are now, I think there's 50 million people who are members of Wattpad, so it's a huge platform. It's free, and that would be a way, if you wanted to get some reaction to something you were writing, you could just create a Wattpad account and do it. I don't know if there's an age limit on that. That would be
Can we
something.
do it for our papers and they just write them for us?
It's what?
I said you can just start writing a school paper on the thing and then get
A little
feedback.
crowdsourcing. For
Crowdsourcing your paper. There's
your
probably
paper.
academic rules on
Talk
that.
about creative. Leave it in their hands.
Yeah. The other one that I use is more for nonfiction, called Medium. Anybody heard of Medium.com?
I think I have.
That's it was created by one of the founders of Twitter, and you can write an essay on Medium. And what I love about it is, as you're writing it, it's formatting it exactly how the reader will see it, and it's beautiful. It's they used to call it "What you see is what you get," WYSIWYG. And as you're writing, you're seeing your piece showing up. You don't have to go through do a draft of it and then all the steps. Instantly, it's looking just the way it's going to look when it's published, and that's pretty cool. The last way to spread what you're writing to people is kind of the simplest one, and it's email. I know there's a guy who graduated from Harvard, and I think when he was at Sidwell Friends School in D.C., he was a funny guy, and he would just write this stuff like comments on the news. And he sent it out to 5 or 10 people, friends, family, and they would get it and they would read it. Baratunde Thurston is his name, and it gradually just grew and grew and grew, and that was sort of his launching pad for now. He's quite a well-known guy in digital media. He was a keynote speaker at South by Southwest a few years ago, and that all started with him just sending stuff out to a few people on email. Now, you can do that if you just have a Gmail account. This MailChimp that I've listed there is a nice email newsletter creation service. It's free up to 1,000 people. So if your distribution list is less than 1,000 people, you can have MailChimp set up a distribution for you for free, and it's pretty easy to set up. Last thing I'll just throw into the pot in case anybody's interested. Say you leave Belmont Hill, you go to college, and you get a job somewhere that isn't in the creative industries. You're a banker or something. Or just, you're making a living, but you still have this hope that someday you're going to write the great American novel or become a major poet. There are these low residence MFA programs, and instead of going somewhere for 2 years to get a master's in fine arts, you generally go for 8 or 10 days a semester to a campus. The one I went to is at Bennington, and then in between, you have a rigorous reading list usually, and you're submitting original work to a teacher who's an established poet or writer of some kind and on the faculty of the program. So you have 5 or 6 weeks of really intense back and forth with the teacher. You go to the campus with all the other students. You do workshops like what you're doing here. It's like summer camp for writers for 10 days. It's really fun. And then you go through the next period of correspondence. They generally cost $10,000 to $20,000 a year. You come out with an MFA, and it's something you could do while you were doing another job. And a very powerful way to, again, find your own voice and really find where you fit in the world of letters by doing something that intensive with other people.
Was your Bennington program that, or were you there full time?
Yeah, I did the low residence.
You did?
Yeah, I retired. I had a job at a gas company out west, and one of the first things I did in retirement, from here I went to Harvard College, majoring in government, and then I worked in a newspaper, and then I got an MBA at Harvard, and then I worked in journalism, and I got a corporate job. And when I retired from the corporate job, I thought, I've got an MBA from Harvard, how about an MFA in poetry to sort of balance things out, And so now I've got an MBA and an MFA, so I can talk to anybody.
I just love that. I think it's such a great thing for you guys to hear about. When these guys come into the class, they write a journal entry about why they wanted to take creative writing. And many people say, I loved it as a young kid, and I never have time for it anymore. And this can happen again in adulthood. The things you're passionate about, you feel like you got to put them aside and make a good living and prove yourself. And that's very valid.
Yeah.
But then to remember to keep those parts of you, they are possible to bring back in. I know my husband now, he put himself through law school building houses, and now he thinks back on that so fondly, and he wishes he was building houses again instead of practicing law. So he's kind of trying to transition into that, and he's got a little project on the side. It makes him so happy to do something creative. Yeah. And so just remember, you can always take twists and turns in that path. There's not just one way to have a good and successful life.
Exactly. I'm going to turn up the gain on the microphone, make sure that you guys can hear it. So I can pull this over here. So who's got a question or a creative challenge you're working on? Or, yeah.
I actually have some question about podcasts in general.
Okay, say who you are.
My name's Bobby Mannion. I'm a fifth former here from Framingham.
Yep.
What do you think about the past 10 years about how podcasts have kind of had this kind of huge surge in popularity, just in general?
Well, it's been pretty stunning. A lot of it's happened on kind of the professional end, like NPR and that Serial podcast that was watched by millions of people. So lots more people are listening to podcasts. That's drawing more content in. And it's getting easier to listen to a podcast. Just about anybody can hit the podcast app on their iPhone, enter Kindle, and find the Kindle Chronicles or whatever else you want. A part of it that's harder to see are more podcasts like mine. I don't make money from my podcast. It's a real niche audience. And I think that sector is probably growing as well. The trouble is that it's harder for what you're doing to be found by anyone because there's such an expansion of the number of them. And I think it's going to continue. I think eventually the car is going to be the place that really is going to drive podcast adoption because it's still a little funky. You have to get in the car, get your app going. Eventually you're going to be able to just say, car, find me a podcast about the Red Sox. And boom, it'll just start playing. So you'll have this really low barrier of finding stuff that you want. And people spend a lot of time in their cars, and that I think is going to. And then the other thing, the smart speakers, Alexa and all that, those are now. If you have a smart speaker and you say, Alexa, play the Kindle Chronicles podcast, my podcast will come right up. You'll just go out there and find it. So the easier it gets for people to find all of this stuff, it'll just keep growing, I think.
Yeah. So do you think it's going to outgrow radio shows, talk radio?
It might. People have been predicting that a long time, and it never really seems to happen. But I can imagine a time, maybe 10 years from now, where people will think it's odd to have to turn on something when it's happening, as opposed to being able to do it whenever it's convenient to listen to it.
It's not how we watch anymore. Most of us.
That's right.
Oh, it's 8 o'clock. I gotta go watch whatever show.
Sunday nights, time for Bonanza. Yeah. Other questions?
So then for the podcast, like what you name it, how you tag it, it's really important, right? Because you reach your audience.
Yeah.
Looking for,
Yeah, the name is important. If you put Kindle in the iTunes thing, my podcast is the first one that comes up. And that's because there's a lot of, I've done 550 episodes. But when you name your podcast, it's good to think of a word that maybe makes it findable, searchable. What else? Anybody have does this give anybody an idea to go home tonight and create a podcast? And if so, what would you call it and what would you call it? If you had the time, if you weren't so overburdened with homework and other things that you had to do.
It would become an assignment. And then it
just
help into your life.
I just have a question for you.
Yeah.
I'm Andrew Lee, 4 and 5 as well, from Weston. When did you realize you wanted to do podcasts?
Good question. I had been blogging in probably the 90s, and I went to a conference in Banff, Canada called Blogs and Dogs. And the deal was you were going to learn how to be a better blogger, and you were going to get a dog sled ride. And they did. They took us out on all these dog sleds, and it was great. And the first night I was there was these guys with a little thing, talking to me. She said, what are you doing? This was at a reception. I said, we're making a podcast. I said, what's a podcast? I said, well, it's this thing. You create audio, you put it up on the internet, anybody can listen to it. And they probably told me about Libsyn. I went back to my room that night, and I created an account, and I put up my first episode. I think I called it the Pod Chronicles. And I said, I'm here in Banff, and I'm just doing my first podcast here. So I was just playing around with it for probably 3 years or so, learning microphones, learning editing, learning all that. Not really knowing what I wanted to do my show about. And that's when the Kindle was introduced in 2007, the following July. I just had the sense that I bet I could talk about this every week forever because I'm so interested in the whole idea of an e-book and what that might mean for literature and authors. So I just, I put up my first episode on July 26, 2008. So there was this, and I'm glad it worked out that way because I had learned a lot of the mechanics of putting the podcast together before my topic was kind of revealed to me, because it just made me so happy to think about it. So that's how that happened.
And usually how long are your podcasts?
45 minutes. I usually have a 20 to 30 minute interview with somebody, and then I have news items about the Kindle or Amazon, and then tech tips, if there's some new way to highlight on a Kindle, I'll talk about it. And then usually there's some comments from listeners. Yeah.
I'm Jack Weldon. I'm also a fifth former from Weston. I was just wondering if you had listened to other podcasts, what your favorite podcasts are.
Well, I'm always looking for podcasts that have interviews so I can learn how to do a better interview. And I think one of my favorite interviewers is a guy named John Thornhill at the Financial Times. And I think his podcast is called Tonic. And it's all about technology, and he always has a guest on. His questions are very short. He listens really actively so that somebody goes on and on. The next question is always right on the money in a way that it advances the conversation. So I like that one a lot. There's a strange guy named Dave Slusher who has a podcast called The Evil Genius. And he just starts talking into a microphone about stuff that is going on with his life, and it's oddly mesmerizing. He takes a lot of risks talking about personal stuff, his mother's death or things that are happening. And I've just grown to like the sound of his voice, so that's one I listen to. I listen to a lot of political stuff. David Axelrod's The Axe Files has really good interviews, and those would be some of the ones. How about some of you that raise your hands listening to podcasts? What do you listen to?
Lucas Media, 45.
Yeah.
Wattpad, Mass. Are you familiar with the Pardon My Take podcast?
Pardon My Take?
Yeah.
No, what's that about?
It's like a sports podcast.
Uh-huh.
It's like the Barstool ads.
Yeah.
Pretty interesting.
Uh-huh. Every weekly?
A couple times a week.
Yeah.
Jonah Wyatt, also Forum 5 from Newton. I sometimes listen to Section 10, also by Barstool Sports. It's about the Red Sox.
Uh-huh.
I like it because it's pretty funny. And like you said, you could talk about the Kindles forever. You can just talk about the Sox forever.
Yeah.
So.
Does he have guests on, or is it just...
Yeah, they recently got access to the Red Sox, so they during the season ended, obviously, but during the season they would interview players, manager, front office, stuff like that. So it was always pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Zephyr Krause, also Form 5 from Barnstool. I also listen to a Barstool Sports podcast. It's called Spittin' Chicklets.
Spittin' Chicklets?
Spittin' Chicklets.
Uh-huh. Spittin' Chicklets, like spitting a chiclet.
Yeah, like a tube, because it's about hockey.
Oh,
and these two former players have ex-NHL players who come on and tell funny stories about their time playing and stuff like that.
Huh.
And they make predictions.
Yeah. Do you get a sense that show would have hundreds of thousands of listeners, or a pretty small group of listeners? Or
It gets a lot of viewers, but a specific audience, definitely.
Right.
I listen to the Joe Rogan podcast.
I've heard of that.
Yeah.
That's like 3 hours long or something?
Yeah, he does a ton of episodes a week, they're like 3 hours long. But he interviews all manner of people. So 1 week he might interview someone who's talking about nutrition, or next week he might interview Elon Musk. He has that. Yeah, he does all sorts of crazy stuff.
I watch the podcast.
Oh, you can see that on video as well?
Yeah, he films it, but he's sitting at the table.
Yeah. And he's like a comedian, and as his professional job. But I think the podcast is so popular now that he just does that as well.
Wow.
I just think it's really interesting because they're super long, and he comes out with a bunch every week, and there's kind of on all topics. So if you have any topic you're interested in, you can find a podcast that lines up with that.
The questions are really good.
Yeah, he's a great interviewer.
He clearly prepares.
Oh, when he's interviewing somebody else.
Yeah, they'll ask questions.
It's
you
basically
have no
an interview.
idea.
Yeah, interview.
It's really
and he'll interview some physicist.
He does Neil deGrasse Tyson, and then he'll turn around and do some technology guy, and they'll do some music artists and stuff, and he'll come in and be asking about their past.
Yeah, the one I'm listening to right now is about he's talking to this Harvard professor who works in anti-aging. Yeah, and then he did another one I listened to a couple weeks ago about this guy who's talking about the cosmos. He does all sorts of crazy stuff. Yeah, it's great.
And it's Joe Rogan.
Yeah. I think it's called the Joe Rogen Experience.
This is the 5th time somebody has mentioned. I'm really jealous of this guy. I'm going to start listening to it.
It's super opinionated, though.
Super opinionated. Yeah. That helps.
I don't know. I think he can flow around. I just agree with this.
Dylan, what were you together?
You said that you've been doing podcasts, but you're not making any profit from it. Do you find it more of a chore or more meditative type of thing?
A chore or what?
Meditative.
Meditative. That's an interesting idea. Well, I think it's sometimes it's a chore. I'll be honest. I mean, it always comes out Friday, and Tuesday or Wednesday I don't know who I'm going to interview yet. And I call it Podcast Mountain. I climb every week. I have to climb Podcast Mountain, and so there is that. And but generally, it's not so much meditative as I feel I'm retired. I'm 68, and every week I get to talk to somebody who has got something interesting to say. And I choose people because I said, well, they did a post and that was really interesting. They've got a book coming out that I'm interested in. So it feels more like a privilege to be able to just reach out to almost anybody I want to talk to. And it's stimulating. I prepare like crazy, and then the half hour that the microphone's on, I all of my senses are alert. And so it's sort of like plugging my creativity into a socket once a week. And there's always a period where I think, this is the show that is going to completely bomb. And it just always happens. And then when I fight through that, and then I'm getting toward the end of it, and it's coming together, I can see it and hear it, this is a great show. This is all right. And then I was listening to it the next day, and I think, that guy's a genius. So it's satisfying. Yeah.
Bobby again.
Yeah.
What's like the most famous, like not most famous, but like the best guest in your opinion that you've had, like the most either interesting to you or gotten the best feedback from others?
Well, I've interviewed Jeff Bezos twice, the head of Amazon. And they, when I was doing it for a while, he was cool. And really nice guy. Like he sat in a little conference room, and he said, now my voice when I laugh can be kind of crazy, so you might want to dial your microphone back. And anyway, he was great. I think another one of my favorite ones, because I took poetry at Bennington, I studied a poet named John Ashbery, who's like a modern poet of some note. And he came out with some ebook versions of his books, and through the publisher I got a chance to interview him. So I'm on the phone with him in New York, and I said, hi, this is John Ashbery. He was really old. It was thrilling. And I just had a chance to, I said, why do you love writing poetry? And he kind of laughed and he said, well, I don't know if I really love it. And it was just this bizarre improv kind of a conversation with an icon in the poetry world. And Donald Hall was another one I had a chance to interview. And then some mystery writers, Dean Koontz, Patricia Cornwell. And then people just starting out. Sometimes a debut author can really make a wonderful interview.
How easy is it for you to, contact these people, or do they respond very quickly? Or
I'm pretty active on Twitter, so a lot of times I'll see if I can find someone on Twitter and I'll do a tweet, and I'd say at least half the time I hear back from people, and a lot of it is I never have anybody, surprisingly, I don't ever have anybody say, how many people listen to your podcast? As in, is this worth my time? Mm-hmm. But when I reach out to someone and say, hey, I saw what you wrote about Amazon in the Post this morning, and I thought it was really interesting because of this, and I have a show called the Kindle Chronicles, and then I'll put a little plug in that says, I've had Jeff Bezos on the show a couple of times, would you like to do an interview? And I think people, when they feel like somebody has noticed them in a real way and isn't just trying to get something from them, are pretty open to having an intelligent conversation. So it's surprisingly easy. I mean, I've had times where it's Tuesday morning, I don't know who I'm going to interview, I see something come across, and I send them something, and in 10 minutes I've got an interview scheduled. That doesn't always happen. But.
Also, you talked about your voice, how you found your voice. Is when you're talking on the podcast versus when you're writing differ, or do you see a very commonality?
Well, I see them kind of merging. I like to think that my writing is getting better because I'm hearing my voice as I write, so it's more informal. There's the sentence structure has some jumps, short sentence, long sentence, and I write out a script most weeks, so it goes the other way too, that a lot of the show I will have scripted, but then when I read it, I'll read it in a way that it doesn't sound like I'm reading a script. It's just reminding me how things are going. So they kind of help each other, I think.
I just want to squeeze in a question before we run out of time, because nonfiction is wonderful. We have a nonfiction writing class. The world is obsessed with nonfiction, but we're in the English department. We believe that you can't live without fiction and poetry, and we're trying to keep that alive.
Yeah.
And I get it with the self-publishing, how fiction fits in, and I love that idea about kind of talking about the process. But if you have any other thoughts for how, because these guys they've just finished one short story, they're starting a new one, then they're doing poetry. Is there any other ways to weave that into podcast world, or would it be more about maybe self-publishing?
Well, I think it would be a great idea to try to create a podcast that way, that hurt.
I was trying to fix my shoe.
Honey, you okay?
We picked that up on the microphone. I just broke my machine here.
The first English class concussion.
One down. Okay, that's a wrap. Thank you very much. It was great.
Thank you so much.
Well, that was a lot of fun. We've gone well over the usual time, but I wanted to get that whole thing in. Part of my personal archive, the return to Belmont Hill. So next week we'll hear from Jerry Riddle. We were going to do this week. Hopefully his voice has recovered. I do want to say that Wendell Webb's Fire tablets got snapped up very quickly. You reached out. One of you I heard stopped during the walk and sent an email right away and got one of the tablets, and they've all been sent by Wendell. I'll have more information on that, including a program that Mark Isero has got in California, and he got one of them, and then Wendell bought another one for him. So that was a great project, and Wendell, thank you for doing that. I'll have a little more information on that next week. This is Len Edgerly for the Kindle Chronicles in downtown Denver. I really appreciate your listening to my show. And Tom and Tish have not arrived yet, so we made our deadline. Good night.